Welcome. Thank you all for joining the U.S. Data Management ECM Best Practice Series webinar. I'm Becky Melody, your hostess for today's presentation. Warren Perry, certified GRC professional from the QMOS team, will be presenting. The discussion today will cover introductions, webinar logistics, direction for post-webinar collaboration, and our discussion topic, content management and the electronic trial master file for the life sciences. We're pleased to have Warren presenting with us today. He's been with QMOS for over 10 years in various roles, including compliance consultant, marketing manager, and project lead. His wealth of experience is gained from tenure with Extito, one of QMOS's regulatory publishing partners, and CDC Solutions, where he was a technical account manager as well as a product manager. For the past 13 years, he has specialized in regulated electronic content management and data normalization, as well as regulatory publishing, working with major retail, banking, and life science companies. Warren demonstrates strength in working for European software companies and an understanding of global markets in GRC, regulatory publishing, and eTMF systems. U.S. data management is focused exclusively on the life science domain. We're the market leader in providing IT, quality, and regulatory compliance professional service solutions. We're headquartered in Ventura, California, and we are a compliance partner for many best-of-breed vendors, including Oracle and SAP. We've delivered more than 1,000 successful projects with over 130 life science clients, and we are the preferred compliance partner for small, mid-tier, and large life science companies. Our various dedicated practices include IT and virtualization, quality and auditing, ECM, ERP, PLM, enterprise quality management, manufacturing automation and equipment, clinical and drug safety, business intelligence, project management, GRC, and our laboratory practice, which includes both systems and equipment. The content will be covered in approximately 30 minutes, and then we'll invite you to post questions for our team via the iLink message board, which you'll find on the lower left of your screen. Or you can join the discussion following the presentation on LinkedIn and post any questions and feedback there. The overall goal of today's webinar is to facilitate discussion, share ideas, and explore solutions together. We do appreciate you taking the time to join us, and now I'll turn the presentation over to Warren.
Becky, thanks very much. I appreciate that, and welcome to everyone who's joined us today. Interesting topic, I think. It's certainly something that, as I visit our customers around the world, seems to be something that everybody wants to talk about. I've been to a couple of seminars lately where they've talked about the massive amount of information that modern clinical trials are generating, the data points, the abilities to sift through all that and make sense of it. To some extent, the TMF and the eTMF reference model assist in that, although it really has a couple of other goals in mind, and that's the ability to respond to effectiveness reviews and audits by agencies, to know that you have all of your documents in place, that they're all as they should be, your inventories are complete, and the quality is complete. So it addresses an awful lot of different areas, and that kind of brings us to the first question, to the first point, which is, what is an eTMF exactly? And in order to know that, we have to talk about what a TMF is. So a trial master file is just exactly that. It is intended to be a single location, an actual physical file or filing cabinet drawer or multiple filing cabinets that contain all of the documents that are necessary to support a clinical trial, really from beginning to end. As probably, I'm sure most of you on the webinar know, that's a relatively burdensome process to bring all of that information together, and then in response to audits and regulatory inquiries, internal inquiries, to find that documentation, to bring it forward to the people who are interested in it, to keep it controlled and audited. So the eTMF, the idea that you would manage all of this documentation electronically, came to light a few years ago. And a couple of different organizations, one is Hague, the other is DIA, have been working on reference models for some time. Important to understand that these are reference models, not guidances, not regulations, not sponsored or impacted by any governmental or regulatory organization, but simply a way for the industry to facilitate exchange of this information. Quite often that exchange might be between the sponsor and the CRO, between the sponsor and the regulator, the auditor, the clinical site auditor internally. There's an awful lot of people who need access to this information over the life of a clinical trial. And this is an effort to bring together a common taxonomy, a common structure, a common set of artifacts, but a set that also is able to grow as more and more types of documents and more information comes into play with clinical trials as they evolve over time. It's very important this reference model not be static, that it be able to accommodate new types of documents as they're introduced into the world of clinical studies. There really isn't a single definition that exists out there of what an eTMF is. This is something that we scratch our heads a lot with as service and software providers within the industry. When someone says, sell me an eTMF, help me build an eTMF, well, the first thing that we have to know is, what do they think an eTMF is? What do they really want? Do they want something as simple as a repository structure and that common taxonomy that says that these documents get tagged in this way and belong in these locations? Do they then want integration with EDC, electronic data capture systems, with the clinical trial management systems themselves? At the most basic level, it's the ability to store, manage, and retrieve all of the documents that are involved in a clinical trial, and to do so electronically. However, as you can imagine, depending upon the size of the organization, something we're going to be talking about in a little while, and the complexity of the studies that are undertaken, that basic definition of an eTMF might change significantly over the life of the project. So really what we're going to talk about is automating the document creation and review, designing workflows that allow you to review and approve content. Once you have all of this stuff in an eTMF structure and assigned and created, you now have the ability to report on it in a number of meaningful ways, graphically, that are going to show you, in fact, do you have all the content? Is it all available? Has it all been created, assigned, started, approved, and so forth? So at really sort of the most fundamental level, an eTMF solution needs a single global repository. This is kind of the foundation upon which the entire house is built. If you are storing various bits and pieces of a complete clinical trial master file in different repositories, which is just a fancy word for databases or filing cabinets or different locations around the world, obviously you do not have a complete clinical trial master file. You need a single place of record where all of the content is stored, and all of it is stored electronically, even if that means scanning some of it in. You need a standardized set of document lists. What does everyone call the same document? This really facilitates bringing partners into the arena and working with the regulators and the auditors. And that's a big, big part of what the reference model is all about. If everybody calls the same thing by the same name, it's going to be a lot easier to interact with people. You need completeness. Once you've designed the study, you have a pretty good idea of exactly how many documents it's going to generate. And you need an inventory that you're able to check off against and know that, in fact, all of those documents have been completed and that the quality of those documents is acceptable. I attended a couple of very interesting sessions on these subjects at the DIA annual in Philadelphia a few months ago, and the statistics coming from the FDA on the number of 483s and other types of regulatory interactions on clinical studies that pertain simply to the completeness of the documentation and the ability to deliver it all into the hands of an FDA inspector is pretty frightening. I mean, it now accounts for a very large percentage of the total number of 483s issued by the agency. Once you have all of that, that really facilitates the idea of on-time submissions. You now have a control plan that you can actually determine whether or not you're in compliance with, another big, big issue to the auditors. You're going to have tremendously improved inspection readiness, the ability to execute hold orders in a very, very meaningful way, and compliance with corporate retention schedules. Really, all of these bullet points say the same thing. It allows you to know all of the documents that should be in your trial master file. It allows you to know the status of all of those documents, and it allows you to access all of those documents quickly and efficiently. This slide is really just kind of intended to reinforce something that, again, I think we all know. There's a lot of moving parts in a clinical trial. There are a lot of people that contribute documents, contribute information, contribute processes and procedures from beginning to end. It is a very, very complex thing that in the end is really intended to generate the information necessary for an ECTD. We don't run the clinical trials simply as an exercise. We run them to get marketing approval for the product. So if all of these documents are in this single, secure, compliant repository, document them in SharePoint or a couple of different examples of what that might be. And that can interact with your clinical trial management system. You can create the dashboards, the reporting, and generate the automatic structures. You can see that this is very, very high-level overview of some of the moving pieces that contribute to a TMF. What does an eTMF give you, and what does the eTMF reference model give you in a vision? And I think it is important to state that it is very much an ongoing thing. The most recent version of the DIA eTMF reference model, version 2, was released back in July at the DIA annual. There is another reference model, another organization out there. Again, because this is not driven by regulators, I tend to think of this as very much the VHS Betamax battle of a few years ago, although there aren't quite as many significant differences between the different reference models. At some point, there'll probably be some harmonization of those within the industry. But what do you get? I mean, what are we really trying to provide with an eTMF? And the 3 bullet points there are really the critical things. It takes an awful lot of human intervention to build a TMF structure. Just even at the highest level, the folders of the documents that go in it, much less the actual documents, the protocols, the investigator CVs, the 1572, the supporting documents, the on and on and on that someone needs to keep track of. And we need those documents to be of a consistent quality. The more consistent the quality of something like a protocol is, the greater the adherence to that protocol is going to be. This gets proven time and time again in audits. So you want this idea of templating. You want the metadata to be standardized. You want to be able to utilize content from external systems. And that's something that I think that it's worth mentioning for a moment here, is the TMF isn't just about creating initial content and pushing it out. It's about storing and consuming the content too, regardless of where that comes from. A great deal of it obviously comes from CROs for most organizations, and you need ways to get that information in to the trial master file structure electronically and properly tagged with metadata. And then you need oversight over all of that. You need a quick and easy way to know the status of the documents, of the content that are involved in this study. So templating the TMF, what is the approach that this says? And what it really says is that it is a highly, highly standardized process within an organization. The folder structure, the content list, the document types, and metadata tend within an organization or the culture of that organization to be very standard, but not necessarily across organizations. So the reference model is an attempt to make that standardization much broader. Make certain that all of the data necessary for the trial master file is readily available. You have all the study numbers, the attributes, the investigators, all of that information. If you think about doing this, and I know many of us on the call think about this all the time, this is, while highly standardized and predictable, it is highly repetitive, and therefore it is subject to human error. Copying and pasting massive folder structures and the same documents to assign to different people for different sites and different studies, it's just an absolute formula for error. And being able to automate this clearly increases the quality, reduces the effort, and eliminates most, if not all, of that error. But kind of goes directly to the idea of, what an eTMF is. How much of it is the assignment and creation of that content? How much of it is the management and inventory of that content? I repeat that point just to make it kind of clear, very clear. Everybody wants to know what an eTMF is. Well, it's as much or as little of these things that we're going to talk about as you want it to be. So this is a screenshot. Here's an example of, at the most basic level, the kind of information that you need to start to collect up about a clinical trial master file. It needs to have a name and a study code and a phase and a substance, dosage strengths, on and on. So, at a very fundamental level, you need to give it this high level, fairly simple and predictable information. You now need to assign study managers, create study sites, have investigators allocated to those sites. This, again, doesn't reflect itself necessarily in a single document, but it's information, it's artifacts about the study itself. And then click the Create button and end up with a study. I'll show you some graphic screenshots of what that looks like in a moment. But to just come back to this, it is the creation of an awful lot of metadata. Again, is just another fancy word for saying information about information. Study managers, investigator profiles, knowing that you have this massive amount of information, that you can readily put your hands on it, and that you can predict exactly what documents are going to be there. So, is it a folder level? Is it collections, which are just logical groups of documents, down to individual documents? So you need the ability to create these at any depth because the attributes are variable. You can quite often think of the depth as the number of sites and the numbers of patients enrolled in those sites. But you need to be able to build out these structures in a very quick and automated way to ensure that, in fact, every study that was inputted, every site, every investigator, there is now a folder, there is a location, there is a place for their documents to go, which then allows you to report on whether or not any documents have been created at that level. So we want to automate as much of this as possible. It's really what the E in the eTMF brings us is automation. We want to attach a set of behaviors to each element. That element might be a single document, it might be a folder or a collection. And that these behaviors are triggered by actions, possibly manually in some cases, but in some cases the start of a particular study in a particular site will trigger clocks and awareness about the fact that we should now begin to expect these documents coming in from this site within this time frame. Because all of that is predictable, it can all be automated, and it can all be automated in a pretty effective and meaningful way. So, here are a couple of examples of this type of event triggering. When an investigator brochure was signed off, that's going to start a 1572 request. When a new safety report is made effective, and something we're going to talk about here in a minute is this idea of distribution. Certain types of documents, once they come into existence or have been completed, it's very critical that they get distributed to the correct audience to consume them. And the ability to automate that distribution process is very critical, and probably no more so than in any area, no more critical than in any area except the safety reporting. So you want to know that documents have been created, they've been reviewed, they've been released, they're available internally, they've been included in the appropriate areas, and that they have been distributed depending upon the type of event immediately, saved for reporting on later. Again, all of this today is largely a manual process. People do these things because they know they get a safety document in their inbox, they're aware that it's been created, and they start to keep track of the types of things that they need to be able to do with that document. That really should be automated so that nothing falls through the cracks, and once again, because it is so definable and predictable, it is very easy to automate that kind of thing. It's very easy to generate a distribution list around who needs to be notified of a safety event, for instance. Maybe notified of the event, maybe actually receive an actual copy of the document. So how the document is going to be distributed. Is it going to be emailed? Is it going to be posted on a site with notification? What supporting materials need to go with it? And can all of that be tracked and recorded, that in fact the notification and the distribution took place? Perhaps there was even some kind of acknowledgement to an external party that they received the document. If they needed to act upon it, they can actually be part of a workflow. So what you can begin to see again is that a place that you put clinical trial information and store it with some metadata around it so you can search on it later is only the very most fundamental aspect of what we would hope in the long term ETFs begin to deliver to organizations. You want to be able to search for artifacts, find out, and an artifact is largely a fancy word for a document, but it might be other things, so they decided to use a new term for it. Does it already exist? So I found it or not found it. Does it not exist? I need to create it, populate some metadata, send it around for review, have all of the actions taken. And again, you can see that some of these things need to be done by humans. Some are best performed by the system. So here's an example again of specifying a particular artifact. So if we look in Section 1, the trial management, in 1.1, the trial oversight, and this kind of begins to give you an overview of what the taxonomy and the hierarchy of the reference model looks like. So here's a particular study number we want to search for at the trial level, perhaps country or site. This is now showing all of the documents that have met at the trial level for that study number. This is the criteria, or excuse me, these are the results of the criteria. There's an audit certificate, a communication plan. trial management plan, and so forth. So you can see that, in fact, these documents exist, or that they don't exist and they need to be created. So if we want to create a document based upon that information, this again is intended to be an example of the proposed types of metadata and information. So we're saying that this is a trial management document out of trial oversight, the product, the indication, and so forth. Are we going to create that document from a template or import it from the file system because it came from another source? And of course, the ability to, as part of this, import multiple documents, perhaps all of the documents from a study report from a CRO, if those documents had all of the proper metadata tagging on them already, and you can automate the import into the system. So now a draft version of the document has been created, and you can see that you want to be able to check that out. You want to be able to, most importantly perhaps, add it to a workflow, send it around for review and approval. So this is backing up a little bit from the idea of just storing documents in an ETF to actually using the structure taxonomy to create the artifacts in it. And the third piece of the puzzle is you need to be able to find those things once they're in there. You need a browse study capability that understands the specific artifact information that's relevant to the reference model and is able, based upon those things, to find the particular documents that you're looking for, check them out, view them, do whatever the thing is, provide them to an auditor or to an investigator. And then finally, the fourth bullet point that was mentioned that we're going to talk about very briefly is we want to be able to do some graphic reporting on those. We want to see how many documents are in the study, how many of them are draft, how many of them have been made effective. You can see we've only got one effective document in there. These are just some very quick types of examples of the reporting that becomes meaningful and available once you have subscribed to one of the reference models and you're actually appending all of that information, that metadata, to the documents as they come into the system. You want to be able to, design these reports, edit these queries, do that sort of thing very quickly, because no two people are going to want exactly the same piece of information out of the study. So just a couple of points to wrap up here in the end. It is an emerging standard. The eTMF is very deep, very wide, and very complex, but it is also highly predictable and completely automatable. Now, it can be done manually, and for small companies, that may be the way you want to do it. You actually create the folder structure out there. You have a list of the different types of attributes that you want to create just on Word documents or PDFs, and use some of the standard tools out there for searching. If you've got a single study, a single compound, whatever the case may be. However, if you have lots of products in the pipeline or lots of studies even on a single product, you need the eTMF, and you need it sooner rather than later, just for the reduction in errors, which, as I stated earlier, is something that the regulators are really, really starting to look at. Now, we attempted to address a pretty deep subject in 30 minutes there. So at this point, Becky, I'll kind of turn this back over to you and see if there are any questions to proceed.
Thank you, Warren. We sure appreciate you sharing your insight there. We will open the floor to questions now, and while you're typing them in, I would remind you that the session has been recorded and will be available on our website, which is, of course, usdatamanagement.com. I'd encourage you to take a look there at the site, and you can review not only the recorded session of today's presentation, but upcoming webinar events, as well as previously recorded sessions. We'd love to hear your feedback. We'd love to hear suggestions for additional topics. And with that, let's go to our first question. Jeff is asking, how many trials are required before an eTMF solution is cost effective?
That's a really good question, and it's very similar to the question, how long is a piece of string? There are so many variables in there that the number of trials, it's a combination really of the numbers of products, the numbers of studies, the numbers of sites, and then of course the numbers of patients that will be enrolled in those studies in those sites. So there isn't a single answer. And then, of course, you have to vary that against what really is your vision of at least an initial eTMF implementation. Is it going to be a repository to store documents in? Are you going to try to automate the creation of documents and the reporting on it? It's a good question, Becky, in the sense that this is why people like U.S. Data Management exist, is to perform that kind of assessment and to provide exactly that kind of advice and help.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. All right, very well. Our next question is from Sherry. She's asking, once the trial is complete, what do I do with the eTMF and all of the documents?
This is another great question, and it's one that I get a lot, and it's one that there is a lot of confusion about, because you don't get to just archive that off onto a hard disk and store it in the vault down at the local bank. These are living documents. They, of course, form the basis of a huge amount of the content that goes into submissions to ECTDs, to the agencies. So you need a very, very secure, we'll go back to that word repository, to maintain it in. It should probably be maintained just as it was created, as a living document, so you have all of the audit trails and all of the information around it. But it is going to have a life that goes on for many, many years after the trial is concluded. So you can't just take it offline and put it away, as so many people hope they can when I get that question.
Very good, very good. Okay, looks like we'll have one more question here, and that's from Darren. He says he would appreciate if you could share more information on managing the intake of documents, not just the structuring, for example, from CROs, et cetera.
Yeah, so this is something that I kind of purposefully avoided during the actual presentation, because now what we're really talking about are specific products from specific vendors rather than an approach. Because, as I think you saw in a couple of those slides that looked at the reference model hierarchy, there's a lot of different types of documents that come from a CRO, and there is a very, very complex folder structure that is maintained and that needs to be maintained all the way through to the submission. And what you really do not want to do is have someone have to take each one of those documents and look, because there can be thousands and thousands of them out of a single study. You don't want to be loading each one of those into the system by hand and applying all of the metadata to the artifact and locating it in the proper folder for two reasons. It's just a painfully tedious chore, and once again, fraught with possibility of human error. So you do really need at this point to look for automation tools to do that. And those different tools are going to come from different vendors, depending upon whether or not your underlying repository is provided by a vendor like QMOS, if it's Documentum, if it's SharePoint, if it's an Oracle database. So you're going to find repository-specific tools from vendors out there. And again, this is an area where you look to someone like U.S. Data Management to guide you in the selection of that tool set.
Very good, very good. Thank you, Warren. Again, thank you for your time in teaming with us in today's presentation. And we want to thank you all there in the audience for attending. We do appreciate the compliments and the thanks of those of you posting here in the chat room. We welcome those compliments. We would prefer, though, if you take a moment and put them out on our USDM the LinkedIn group page. It's great to share those compliments with additional USDM audience as well. If you have just a moment, it would mean quite a bit to us. In 2012, that's an indicator that our management team is going to be looking at and using as a basis for continuing to fund our complimentary educational series here in compliance. Again, thanks for taking the time to join us today. We do appreciate the opportunity to team with you towards excellence in compliance. Have a wonderful day.